and a lot of the changes in the workforce, of course, are managed through HR and through managerial changes, through corporate structural changes. But companies are realizing that there is a lot of potential in their actual space to support some of the biggest pressures they're under. And when you categorize all the pressures, when you look at all of them, what we find is they generally fall into one of these three buckets. That is, how can we use our space better? Usually that's around saving money, whether it's reducing the amount of real estate people have or certainly not taking on new real estate and making the real estate more effective. People are concerned about innovation. How can we use our workplace to support more knowledge sharing and more problem solving and create better market share? And then the last one, of course, one that we've seen a tremendous increase in the last few years is this notion of engagement, recruitment, retention, satisfaction, loyalty, inspiration, motivation. So these are the three sort of biggest pressures we're seeing organizations thinking about today. And as I mentioned, a lot of this stuff we can deal with through managerial changes, who we hire, how we train them, how we do our processes. But the space can certainly play a big role. And I think for a lot of clients, it's important to help them understand that the workplace is not a static thing. And we're not just changing quickly lately. It seems like it. It seems like there's a lot of change going on. But I like to remind them that change has actually been going on in the workplace for over 100 years in this country. And in fact, if you think about the history of workplace design, the way we know it, corporate interiors, workplace design, it really didn't start till the early 1900s. I mean, before the 1900s, there was no concerted effort around workplace design. Space was used normally on a factory floor. Tables and chairs were put in to support things like bookkeeping and personnel. It was really in the early 1900s, particularly as organizations started building headquarters and they started moving into more urban settings in high-rise buildings, and when you see organizations that were not manufacturers themselves but emerged to support manufacturing, such as finance, insurance, professional engineering, architectural firms, they didn't have a factory, right? So this new paradigm of workplace was created, and this model that you're seeing on the far left is really about where the workplace was in the early 1920s and 30s, and that was, again, a result partially of moving into more high-rise buildings in urban settings, the way that building systems worked in terms of their base structure, the way that ventilation worked, and also, more importantly, the way that corporations were themselves formed. You know, in the early part of the 1900s, most corporations were composed of highly professional men, mostly, who had private offices and were fairly autonomous in their work and were supported by a secretarial staff. So this model that you see on the far left of private offices around the perimeter, supported by secretaries, the sort of the smaller green squares in the middle, and then conference rooms, it was not only the predominant model because of the way buildings were built, but that's the way corporations were built. Now, this model continued for a long time. Of course, after World War I and after World War II especially, you begin to see a relationship between people's status in the organization and what size office they had, whether it was located on the corner and whether it was on a low floor or high floor. And of course, this was a reflection of the influence of the post sort of military command and control structures that were sort of mapped over the U.S. workplace. But this model continued for probably through, let's say, the 70s or 80s. And in that time, we started to see a breakdown of this paradigm. And it happened for a couple of reasons. First off, we began to see, especially with the introduction of the computer in the workplace, lots more information that had to be managed. And you needed a lot of people to manage the information. We also saw other changes in the workforce, particularly women coming back to work. And so what you start to see in the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s is the breakdown of this model begins, and you start to see fewer and fewer high-level professionals, and so therefore fewer private offices, and you start to see larger and larger staffs. And so you start to see more smaller offices, or of course in the 70s and 80s with the advent of open office systems furniture, you begin to see more open office planning. So this march of this breakdown of this structure continued throughout the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, so that by the time you get to about 2000, The model that you see on the far left had almost completely turned itself inside outwards. Now, of course, another thing that helped propel this inversion, if you will, especially in the late 1990s, early 2000s, was sustainability, the whole movement around LEED standards, particularly around views and natural light, which propelled a lot of organizations to move offices and large conference rooms off the perimeter and move them inboard. So the other thing that you're seeing here, of course, as I mentioned, is that the corporations themselves changed. Now what you see is, instead of lots of professional people supported by a few secretaries, now what you see are very large staffs of employees who are managed by a few people. Now, about in the last 10 years, we've even begun to see this model in the center breakdown, and that breakdown has happened for a couple of reasons. First off, particularly in the last 15 years, there's been a lot of concern about collaboration. And so what we saw was people taking workstations and large conference rooms out, and even private offices out, and starting to break those down into what's in this middle diagram is colored the pink and the navy blue. Started inserting the collaborative zones. So we start seeing a lot more of these little areas for teamwork and collaborative. You know, people call them different things, the breakout, the huddle spaces, those sorts of things. And we begin to see those populate the floor plan. Now, a curious thing started happening about this time too, though, is that people became really interested in conserving real estate or even reducing it. And so, unfortunately, one thing we saw happen was, as people attempted to put more of these open sort of collaborative spaces on the floor, that usually meant that individual workstations were starting to get smaller. People who'd had private offices were now being moved to open office, and all of this was an attempt to save space and repurpose some of that space into the collaborative zones. Now, as this became more and more pressure for people to create even better real estate, there was a move, especially in the last 5 to 10 years, to take a lot of these workstations that you see and convert them to mobile stations. You may call them touchdown, hoteling, shared desk, hot desk. But what happened was people began to realize, because of technology and the way we work today, is that people were coming to work less and less often. And so this model began to break down too, where we started seeing more and more types of settings and more of them becoming unassigned. Now, where is that leading us? That's really leading us towards this new idea of a workplace where you have very few spaces that are actually assigned. In fact, I will tell you that a lot of the clients that I work with have moved, even though it says 2025, they're already there, and they've moved to workplaces that are almost totally unassigned. And instead of just being composed of 3 types of spaces, offices, workstations, and conference rooms, and then maybe a few more open collaborative zones, now you might see 9 or 10 different types of settings. So when you go on the floor plate, instead of seeing a big sea of workstations and some offices and maybe a few conference rooms, you walk onto the same floor plate, and now you see something that looks like a mixture of a Starbucks and a hotel lobby and the reading room at a public library and an airline sky club and maybe your living room at home. It's a completely different type of environment, and it's one where there's a lot of choice and variety. People are spread out because you only are providing enough seats to accommodate the maximum number of people who are there every day, instead of giving everybody an assigned seat. And so what happens is these create completely different kind of environments, and it's up to the individual employee to make a decision about where he or she is going to work that morning or that day or that week and who they're going to sit next to. But again, the reason we're seeing this change is not because people like Herman Miller or design firms are coming and saying, hey, you should change your workplace so that you can change the way you work. Rather, what we're seeing is that companies are recognizing that people are already changing the way they work, and what we're seeing is the workplace change to support it in the same way that it changed from the 1920s to the 70s and 80s to the 2000s. This is just an arc of transformation in the workplace that represents the way change is happening. Now, when we talk about these settings, by the way, you know, every organization you work with probably has different types of settings. You know, one of the things we've done at Herman Miller is we've tried to understand what are the ideal sort of set of settings, if you will, that most workplaces can use. These are the 10 that we use over and over again. I won't go into a lot of detail. If you're interested in learning more about it, you can get information off our website. The point I'm trying to make here is that what we're seeing is a mixture of individual and group spaces. Some are open and some are closed, and the distribution and the quantity of those is based on a couple of key data points that you collect. So that's the arc of transformation that we're seeing. And let me talk a little bit now about those 3 pressures, which were utilization, innovation, and engagement, and talk a little bit about how these new workplaces, which you can think of as free address activity-based workplaces, how they support or address those challenges. So I want to start with utilization because it's the one that's easiest to explain, and it's often the one that is actually the driver of a lot of change we see in the workplace. And that, of course, is how can we use our space better? As I mentioned earlier, a lot of organizations I'm dealing with are trying to not add any real estate. Perhaps they're trying to even reduce real estate. And unfortunately, as I mentioned, one of the poor remedies to this is to just try and get more people in the same amount of space. This notion of densification, has presented some problems over the last few years because what we're finding is these environments are often crowded, they're noisy, people feel like they're on top of each other, and they don't really provide the quality of work that people are looking for, even though they may meet the quantifiable goals. So when we look at utilization, something that's going on is that we're finding that space is much less utilized than it used to be. Now, when I talk about utilization, by the way, I want to make a distinction between utilization and occupancy, right? Occupancy is, the rate of which your spaces are assigned or unassigned to someone, or there's some purpose or there's some use for them. Utilization is of all those spaces, whether they're private offices or workstations or even conference rooms, at any given moment, what percentage of people are actually in those seats. Whether they own them, you're right, whether they're occupied. So I may have a desk, I occupy that desk, but I'm not there on Monday, so I'm not utilizing it. So, we've been studying utilization for a long time now at Herman Miller, and there's a lot of other organizations. Some of our competitors in our industry are doing it. A lot of real estate groups are doing it. There are third-party companies that measure utilization, and what we find is that we're all finding the same numbers, and those are that the average utilization of a workstation, the percentage of time during business hours that the person who owns that workstation is actually in it, is hovering around 40% in this country. Now, it varies a little bit by industry, but not very much. We tend to find that professional services, architecture, design, and engineering, and retail tend to have the highest numbers, pushing 48 to 50%, and some of industries like oil and gas and energy tend to have the lowest utilizations, hovering more around 28%, but they all sort of average out to this 40% range. Office utilization, we're finding around 23%, and the thing about offices, particularly in legacy buildings, is they're usually take up more space, and in older buildings they actually take up better space. They're actually on the windows. Now, conference rooms are an interesting element to study because we find that they're actually pretty heavily used. In fact, I'm sure you probably hear your clients or your internal users telling you they need more conference rooms. They can't find a conference room, and we find that's actually true. Conference rooms are heavily used in this country, and that's because more and more of what we're doing is actually not alone work. A lot of that alone work is being done elsewhere, at home or somewhere. But when people are coming in, they're often coming in to meet. But what we're finding is the number of seats that are being used at any given time is relatively low. Usually less than half of seats in conference rooms, especially if they have 12, 14, 16, 18 seats, usually half the seats are being used. In fact, on average, conference rooms in the United States have about 14 seats in them, and the average actual meeting, the average number of people in there is a little less than 4. So this is the kind of information that I find that clients really need if they want to move forward and they want to progress their workplace. Now, I know in the past, the way we were taught to do it, right, was we would make appointments with each department head, and we would go around and ask people, how many offices do you need, how many workstations do you need, how many conference rooms do you need, and we'd make a spreadsheet and we'd figure all that out based on some corporate standard or some BOMA standard for space. But what we're finding is that that method that we've all learned to use and used for many, many years is not really the method that's going to work anymore to get us to these new kind of workplaces, for lots of reasons. But the most important thing is that to get that data that you really need to move an organization forward, the very first piece of data we want to get is this space utilization data. Now, as I mentioned, we've been doing these studies at Herman Miller. Lots of people in the industry are doing it. The way we do it is we do a 3-week study, and you may know about our motion detectors. They go under a chair or a table, and they send a signal back to a wireless router every 10 seconds. We do these studies for 3 weeks, and this graph, or this little chart you're seeing on the screen right now, represents a very, very typical pattern of Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, with the increased usage towards the middle of the week, falling off on the, towards the tails. So there's 3 weeks there: Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, etc. This is a very, very typical diagram. And when we use this data, what I'm going to look for, first off, this white dashed line represents the average utilization, right? That's the first thing that I want to figure out, the average utilization. Another number we like to look at is what's called the peak average utilization, or the average peak utilization. And that is, on average, what were the most amount of people that were ever there, right? And then another important number to look at is the absolute peak. Like on what was on for the whole study, what was the most amount of people that were ever there. So what can we use this data for? Well, you know, as I mentioned earlier, I think the primary way to use this data is to shift to a new planning process. In other words, getting away from that way we used to do it of just going around and asking people how many offices they need, but rather saying, look, here's the data on your space usage. Let's figure out how much space and the type of space you need to actually support the way your staff is working. And I do that by creating alternate scenarios. So for example, if I was going to use the average data, that would be very aggressive. Say I have 100 people, they're only there 40% of the time, I only provide 40 seats. Well, that's very aggressive, but that's one scenario. Another scenario might be the most people that were ever there are 65 people, so I'm going to provide 65 seats, right? That's sort of a safer approach or scenario. The scenario I generally use is if I have 100 people and they're there on an average of 40%, I still might provide 100 seats, but 40 of those would be in individual type workstations, and the other 60 would be distributed around other types of settings. So that's 3 different scenarios right there, but of course you got to have the data. Then for each one of those you can build the business case, you know, the what ifs, especially around the financials, whether it's lease cost, operating cost, furniture cost, and other costs that are involved with the different scenarios. And to me, fundamentally, this is the way you support change. You know, I have a lot of people come and ask me, what do we do about change management? You know, we're going to present this new idea to people and we really need a lot of change management to get them on board. There's a lot of pushback. They don't like it. And my answer to that, well, is if you're doing something that people are really pushing back on and they don't like, then you probably shouldn't be doing it. And just putting a lot of change management on it is not going to convince people. The better thing to do is to sort of get your data from the beginning, explain sort of what the data is telling you, and how you're going to create specs that better supports the way people work, so you don't have to convince them that it's something onerous, right? Now let me show you some examples of that. This drawing that you see on the screen, and you'll notice it's called a 1995 workplace, because as you can see by looking at it, it's a very, very conventional workplace. It's not unlike that diagram, that first diagram on the far left I showed you. Private offices around the perimeter, workstations in the middle. These are pretty big workstations. They've even got those big corners when we used to have those big old monitors, 2 giant conference rooms, and that's it. I mean, this is a pretty typical sort of plan that we would see coming out of the sort of 90s. And a lot of clients that I'm working with right now, this is what they're in now, and they're trying to move in a different direction. Now, what you see on this plan is there's 88 capacity, 88 head count. So there's 88 seats on the floor and there's 88 people. So again, a very typical 1-to-1 ratio. There's no sharing going on here. It's just everyone gets a seat. Now, I will tell you that this client, this is a real client, this is real data, they were out of room. This is an organization that's growing, and so the department heads in this particular setting went to the leadership and said, hey, we need a new building. or we need to do something to get more people on the floor. So there's a couple different ways you could go. A, you could build a new building, which is an expensive venture for most organizations. Or B, something that has started happening is you take everyone out of offices and you put everyone at smaller workstations, and yes, you can get more people on the floor. The problem with that approach is it's not terribly satisfactory. People don't really like it. So our first response is, look, first off, let's get some data to find out how the space is being used. And we did just that. We collected data with the motion detectors, and what we found is that these workstations were in use about 27% of the time during the business week. Now, this is a pretty technologically savvy organization. People have laptops and tablets and smartphones. There's Wi-Fi all over the building. This happens to be also on a corporate campus, so there are other places where people can go work, and they also have a fairly liberal sort of telework program, so people can also, in conjunction with their team leader, whatever works, they can also choose to work at home or other places. And that sort of explains this sort of utilization. And we saw 36% office utilization. So now I will tell you that these numbers are fairly typical of organizations. These happen to be broadcast engineers and broadcasting company project managers. Now this little donut chart I'm going to show you right here is a typical distribution that we see of the actual utilization. And what I mean by that is if you look, you'll see that 24% of these seats, okay, or 1 in 4 of these seats was only in use 10% of the time or less during our study. So 1 in 4 seats basically had the person in it who owned it fewer than 4 hours a week. Now, on the other hand, you see only 6% of the seats had someone in them 60% of the time, which is the same thing as saying only 6% of the seats in the whole study, and by the way, this was a 4-story building, only 6% of these seats had the person in it who belonged to that seat more than 3 days a week. And what we generally find when we go in and look and see who those people are, they're usually administrative, secretarial support staff, right? So the question becomes, do you really need to build another building, or do we need to utilize our space better? Well, so if we were going to try and utilize the space better, there's sort of 2 approaches we can take. Now, this first approach I'm going to show you is one that we would have done about 10 or 15 years ago. I call it 10 years ago. I call it the 2010 approach. And what you're seeing on the floor plan represents to some degree what I was showing you in those 3 diagrams as the middle diagram. And this was an approach that I still see companies take, and it can still be a valid approach. And that is, first off, you see that there are fewer private offices, right, the dark green, and the offices that you have are now inboard, right? We all started doing that around 2000s because of LEED. We also moved from big enclosed workstations to workstations that are still generous. These are 7-foot work surfaces. I think these are 7 by 7 or maybe 7 by 6.5. Using simple kit of parts. We started bringing the horizon on the panels down. A lot of that had to do with collaboration and visibility, which unfortunately, if people are close together, it can actually backfire on you. One of the other things that we started doing around 10 years ago was we started creating workstations that were especially made for people who had private offices previously and who'd come out onto the floor. And these are the workstations that you see that are around the edges here, the far left edge, and you'll notice they're slightly different. They might have taller panels. There's usually space for a small table and chairs. And the idea behind these, which some people started calling the managers' workstations, were that they were supposed to make up sort of for the fact that you didn't have a private office anymore. They weren't generally well received, especially if some people got to keep private offices and other people didn't. This created a lot of anxiety in the workplace. But nevertheless, that's sort of what we were doing. And if you see these dark gray seats in the middle around the stairwell and these 2 offices right here, what those represent, of course, in the last 10 years is creating the mobile workstations, the touchdown, the hoteling. These are the spaces when companies were recognizing that we really do have people that are here less than half the time. They can just use one of these touchdown stations when they're here. Now, we did see increased efficiency when it comes to headcount. Remember, the last plan had 88 people and it had 88 seats. Well, now we have 95 seats, and based on the number of or the sharing ratio of these mobile seats, which I've just put 10% of the people at a 2-to-1 ratio, I'm saying you could actually have 112 people who belong to the floor. So what we started to see is this divergence between headcount and capacity. They used to be one-to-one, and now we started to see this breakdown. Now, as workplaces became even more, there was even more emphasis on saving more space, we started to see some changes to this plan, and that's what I showed you in the little diagram before. Some of these workstations started being changed to unassigned. Sometimes you would see a 4-pack, like one of these typical four-person workstations you see here, be taken out, and maybe a benching workstation for 6 people was put back in its place. Maybe some of these offices actually got converted to unassigned offices that could double as conference rooms. So we saw people trying to take this idea and keep tweaking it to accommodate even more and more people and to accommodate more and more types of work. So for example, where you've got the 2 visitors office, we started to see people take all of that out and drop in some open collaborative areas. Now, 2 problems with that were that first off, most collaboration in the workplace doesn't actually happen in these open collaborative spaces we make. Most collaboration actually happens between 2 people at one of their desks. So the irony of making desks smaller with the thought that by doing that you could free up space and put in collaborative zones was really a little misguided, because in fact most of the collaboration happened at the workplace. So as workstations got, at the workstation. So as workstations got smaller and smaller, people got close together. When they tried to have conversations at the desk, they just become very difficult and they bother other people. We also found that if you have a high percentage of seats that are assigned, so in other words, if everyone has an assigned workstation or office and you put in a lot of other open kind of places and tell people that they can go work there, well, in fact, they really sort of don't, because if you've got your own assigned space, what happens is you tend to build up all your stuff there. You keep all your stuff there. You have your computer. You have all your stuff. There's very little incentive for you to gather up all your stuff and move 25 feet away. So what happened was we got into this situation where these workplaces just really didn't support the way people were working. Now, where did that lead us? It led us here to this next sort of paradigm. And again, this is the sort of free address activity-based workplace. And it's based on collecting space utilization data to understand how often people are actually at work, and then doing some other exercises, some activity-based workplace exercises to find out when people are there, are they mostly working alone or are they mostly working with each other? In fact, I will tell you that today those are really the only 2 questions I need to answer when I go into an organization. And it doesn't matter what kind of organization. I don't care if it's engineers, if it's lawyers, if it's accountants, if it's HR, manufacturing, architecture. It really doesn't matter. The only thing that seems to matter now, the way people are working, is how often they're at work, and when they are there, are they mostly working by themselves, or are they working with other people? And knowing those 2 things can allow us to balance these floor plates so that you've got enough seats to accommodate most people when they're there and to give them lots of choice about where they sit. Now, the advantage, besides the psychological notion of giving people choice and treating them fairly and having more transparency, is, of course, the utilization of the space is much better. For example, this particular plan has 125 seats, so we call these work points, because we can't really call them workstations and offices anymore, because I could sit out here on this sofa and work, or I could sit in this pink zone and work, so we're calling them work points because it means really people can work anywhere. So there's 125 of these seats, and actually there's really more than that, because I'll tell you that the seats that you see that look like individual seats, the ones in light green and dark green and even this gray area, these little gray areas, when I count those seats, I count those each as 1 seat. But when I go count seats in these pink areas that we call coves, or these blue areas called landings, or these big plaza areas in the middle, I'm only going to count every other seat, because I'm going to assume if somebody's sitting and working on a sofa and you want to sit on the sofa and work, you're probably not going to sit right next to that person. So really there's actually more seats than that on the floor, but we call it 125, and knowing that these people were only here 27% of the time, I'm actually going to be more conservative and hope that they come in 50% of the time. You could have 250 people that belong to this floor. And furthermore, if you hire 5 new people, you don't have to call facilities and go, oh my gosh, we've hired 5 people, where are we going to put them? We're going to have to tear down 3 large cubicles and make 6 small ones. No, the floor can absorb those people. Now, this does require, a different way of thinking about whether or not you're not an owner of space, you're a member of space. We're not talking about a paperless environment here, but we're certainly talking about less paper, particularly resources being online, uh, not having as much stuff at your desk all the time, which I will tell you, one of the other things that we do at Herman Miller is we make a study of how often people use all the items at their desk, and what we're finding is that for people who are assigned to a desk, whether it's a workstation or office, they usually only touch about 10% of the items at their desk annually. We also know that it doesn't really matter what people are doing. If you watch them today when they're working alone, they're 95% of the time working on the computer. They may also be talking on the phone, and they usually have 2 or 3 pieces of paper or one folder open at a time. So there are certainly ways to deal with some of the issues you might be thinking are a problem, and what we find that those actually turn out to not to be problems after all, especially if you provide some means of storage, whether it's a file drawer or a closet. Some people like to use lockers. Personally, I'm not wild about lockers. I prefer file drawers. But there are certainly ways to deal with that. Other people worry about, how can I personalize my space? Well, yes, that is something that we have to let go of a little bit. And I think most people are willing to trade sort of choice and personal freedom for the ability to sort of, personalize one 8x8 space. It really becomes more about personalizing your work experience. There are other issues too, but and I have a paper, if anyone's interested, I can share with you that's like what are the 7 or 8 most common pushbacks or concerns you hear when you talk about these environments, and what are some responses to those. I'd be happy to share if you'll just let us know. Now, as I mentioned before, there were 3 different pressures we were looking at, right? Utilization, innovation, and engagement. So I want to talk about innovation now. When we talk about innovation in the workplace, by the way, we're not just talking about the sort of romantic notion of companies sitting around brainstorming, coming up with big ideas. Innovation also means things like knowledge sharing and mentoring and informal learning and smooth operations and processes in your workplace. And when we talk to our client groups, and these are studies that we've conducted at Herman Miller, what we've learned is that over half the CEOs that we talk to say that being more innovative is their number one, is their top, it's in their top tier of strategies. And of those, a third of them are telling us that it's actually the number one strategy, right? So at least half the organizations are concerned about innovation, and a third of the organizations we talk with say it's their number one way to grow. And then we ask people, what are you doing? And what we get back is normally we're trying to create a culture of innovation. More than half the companies we talk with tell us that they want to or they're trying to. But I can tell you, when I ask them specifically how they're doing this, I usually don't get a lot of robust answers back, particularly when it comes to space. When I do get answers back, they're usually oftentimes somewhat trivial. Well, we're going to put in an atrium, or we're going to put a connecting stair between 2 floors, or we're going to put in a better coffee machine in the coffee bar, or a rock climbing wall, or, people have all these sorts of ideas. But they don't always work the way people think that they will. In fact, what we've learned, and this happens to be my area of research, this is what I did my doctorate in at Georgia Tech, is if we really want to support innovation in the workplace, especially from a design perspective. Now, I'm not talking about management and training and all that sort of stuff. We're just talking about from a physical standpoint, which is only one part of that bigger formula. Then what we want to do is we want to create more opportunities for informal interaction, right? Those quick, unscheduled, face-to-face, events that happen all day long. You hear them referred to as the bump in, the collision, the spontaneous. And I know they've gotten a lot of, people talk about it a lot in the press. There's a lot of buzz around it. And to the point that sometimes we sort of think it's become cliche. But the point is, it is important. Even though it seems cliche, it is important to support these kind of collaborations. And the reason we need to support them is because, first off, they're the most common type. Informal interaction is the most common type of collaboration in the workplace. It's usually between 2 people at one of their desks, or if one person is working and the other person walks by. And you say, hey, come here, will you help me? Or I'm sitting and working and I see somebody walk by and I say, hey, come over here, I need your help. we know that these are the most common. In fact, for every formal meeting you go to, you'll probably have 20 or 25 of these informal interactions. The second reason we want to support informal interaction is because they are highly robust when you measure outcome variables, because they not only support that romantic notion of innovation I talked about, the big brainstorming moment. You run into someone in the break room, you know, you start talking and pow, you created something great like Velcro, you know, or Post-it notes. But it turns out that these informal interactions also support a lot of other more mundane types of processes, just like, you know, getting things done, troubleshooting, getting questions answered, keeping the project moving, but also socialization, getting to know each other, enculturation, which is learning how to behave in the organization, employee oversight, ethics. There's a whole range of reasons we want to support informal interaction. The last one, though, which I think is the most significant to us in design, is that informal interactions are highly sensitive to space. They're highly sensitive to the way space is organized. Now, formal, structured interactions, again, like a meeting, an all-hands meeting, or a meeting that you would go to in a conference room, these are not sensitive to space because they are destinations. You're told where the meeting is, and that's where you go. But informal interaction, it turns out, we can actually predict and influence the frequency and location of these informal interactions based purely on the way we lay out space. Now, in order to do that, there's a couple of little tools you can use to understand to what degree your plan is going to support more informal interaction or not. The first one is to look at the layout. And if you see on your screen, what I've shown you now is that sort of 1995 plan. I've skipped over the middle one and gone right to the 2025 plan. And I want to show you how just the circulation alone can support this idea of informal interaction. So you see the traditional plan on the left, and what you see mapped over it now are these red dots and orange dots and blue dots and lines. This is a method called space syntax, and if any of y'all have ever seen me do Where's the Big Idea, another presentation I do, you've seen me go into a lot more detail. But basically this is a method and an analysis tool that allows you to actually understand how many ways there are to move around the organization. This one has 98 different ways on average to get from one point to any other point. Not that anyone would ever do all 98, but it's an indicator of how much movement potential there is in the plan. It also tells you the number of intersections there are per path. This one happens to have 1.68. I can tell you from experience that if you have a plan that has fewer than 2 intersections per path, you're probably not going to see a lot of movement and encounter, or it's going to be very limited to a small zone. Also, if you just look at the color of the lines and the dots, you can see that those lines that are red, orange, and yellow, what we know from the way people move around is that's where most of the traffic's going to happen, which means most people are going to move around on 1 or 2 paths. Now, what's going to happen, of course, is because circulation is not evenly distributed, you're going to get some people in this plan who are going to be overstimulated. Like everybody's going by my desk all the time, I can't get any work done, right? Then you've got other people who are off of a blue dot. They're going to feel isolated. Now, ideally, what you want is you want these dots to be better distributed. So in other words, if you've got a red dot, which is where most traffic is going to happen, you want that to fall in an area where you want people to walk past each other and engage. And if you've got blue dots, you want those to be in areas where there can be more quiet. That's what's happening on the left-hand side. The left-hand plan, which is the 2025 plan, as I showed you earlier, has a variety of settings. The setting right smack dab in the middle is what we call the plaza. That's a big open public area. I mean, it's like Times Square, the Piazza San Marco. People are going to walk through there and they can choose to just ignore people, or they can wave at people, or they can move over and talk to them, or they can sit down and engage with them, right? But it's the big public way. Then as you move away from the center, as you move more and more to the edges, what you want is the spaces naturally become quieter and quieter because there's less traffic there. And in fact, if I turn on the analysis tool, you can see that in fact that the main path, the most important path, the red, orange, and yellow lines and intersections are cutting right through that plaza, which is what you want. The second most important one is over here by these conference rooms. And as you move away from the center where most of the big traffic is going to happen, and you get back to the quieter individual work areas, notice that the lines get blue, green, and then dark blue. And that's what you want, because you want better alignment between the way traffic is going to flow and what you put there. Right? The other thing is that this plan on the right actually has 202 different ways to move around, whereas the one on the left had 98. And one of the things that we know is that when you have more ways to move around a plan, people naturally distribute their circulation. So rather than all the circulation happen on 98 lines, now all the circulation is going to happen on 202 lines, and so the distribution of the circulation is just going to be more equitable. And the plan on the right also has 2 intersections per path, which is my threshold, by the way. When I do a floor plan, I always want to make sure I have at least 2 intersections per path, because I know that means that you're going to get more even distribution. Now, I've just barely touched the surface here on space syntax and this whole science of movement encounter. But if you're interested in knowing more about it, I can share more information with you. But it's a really, really cool tool to understand how your space is being used. Now, similar to layout is another consideration of space planning we have to be concerned about if we want to create more innovation, and that is distance. Distance has a very powerful effect. Distance has a very powerful effect on how many people will talk to each other and how they'll get to know each other. In the plan on the left, especially if people are assigned, what's going to happen is people are only going to get to know and work with people right around them. And in fact, that range is about 30 meters. And the 30-meter rule, you may have heard of it in the past. Sometimes you may hear it referred to as the Allen curve. And this is a known phenomenon, not just in corporate settings, but in other types of spaces where people generally just get to know and work with the people that sit within about 30 meters of them, or 99 feet. So we see this a lot, not only in corporate settings, we see it in faculty buildings, we see it in laboratory buildings, where people have a pretty tight roaming radius. So if you're sitting down here in the bottom left-hand corner, this little purple arc here, which represents the 30-meter radius, these are the people that you're going to work with and get to know and call on and say, hey, let's go talk to Bill. I think he's done this before, or something like that. Now, one of the advantages of moving to these sort of free address, activity-based workplaces is even if you choose to sit in the same seat every day in the bottom left-hand corner, which when we do these workplaces, we always have a couple of people who say, well, I'm going to sit in the same place every day. Well, that's fine. That's choice, But even if you sit in the same seat every day, the world around you will change a little bit, and that will start to offset the challenge of this 30-meter rule that people tend to impose on themselves. Very similarly is this notion of visibility. Now, this is work that was done mostly by Michael Benedict down at UT Austin, and he found that there's a strong correlation, as we did when I was at Tech, between the number of people that you can see when you're either at your seat or when you're walking around, and all sorts of, not just measures of collaboration, but it turns out even measures of engagement, sense of belonging, sense of awareness, pride in the organization, inspiration, motivation. So, in the workplace, for example, if you're, again, the person who's sitting down in this left-hand corner, well, actually, you couldn't see anybody. You'd have to go stand at your doorway, and even then, you really couldn't see anybody. One of the advantages of moving to these workplaces, these free address workplaces, is they generally tend to be a little bit more open, although I should give the caveat here that moving to this kind of new workplace is not necessarily open. Like a lot of times I hear people say we're moving everyone to an open environment and nobody likes it. Well, I'd say, well, the first thing is quit saying open because these workplaces aren't just about openness. That is part of it, but they're not just about that. But they do tend to be a little bit more open, and so what happens is you can see more people. And the important point about this is even if you don't talk to those people, just your awareness of them improves all sorts of other measures of engagement. Just being able to see the people you work for, and I'll tell you, that's probably the most important person. One of the things we found from research is if you really want to ratchet up people's feelings of belonging, engagement in the organization, is make sure when they're working, they can see the leadership. They can see the people they work for, their boss or their team leader, their supervisor, whatever you call it. Hiding those people away from the people who work for them is really detrimental to the organization. So that was layout, distance, and visibility. And by the way, those are the only three variables that we have ever been able to ascribe any outcomes around collaboration to. When I was at Georgia Tech, we looked at things like, does the building have an atrium? Does it have a big monumental stair? Does it have a main street? How much glass is there? All sorts of different questions. And what we found were these were the only three that really we could predict patterns of movement and encounter. Now, I do want to share one more with you that's not it's not a variable we studied, but it's something we found as we did our studies, and that was this notion of paired working. Again, that 70, 80, in an R&D facility, as much as 90% of all this collaboration that people are trying to create actually happens at somebody's seat or wherever they're working and someone else walks by. This is, and most of the time people are seated at a desk, whether it's their desk or it's a table. This notion of paired working, I think, is one of the most powerful things that's been overlooked in the workplace, particularly if you see companies that were trying to make workstations smaller, and then they'd say, but we're going to put some collaborative zones over there. Well, the problem is that the workstation is the primary collaborative zone, or wherever someone's working. It's so important that, well, I had a client who actually took this Aeron chair into Photoshop and played with it to make it into what he called a pair-on. Okay, obviously this is not a real piece of furniture, but the point he was trying to make is that this is really the way most work happens in the workplace. Right? Okay, so then the very last one here is engagement. So we've talked a little bit about collaboration. We're trying to increase collaboration in the workplace through utilization. We talked about innovation, and now we're going to talk about engagement. Now, engagement turns out is going to be a really big deal, and I'm sure y'all have all heard this from your own clients in the last few years. Everyone's concerned about recruitment, retention, performance, productivity, all these sorts of measures. And we see a lot of people doing a lot of different things to try and increase engagement, whether it's managerial, through team building, through training, or sometimes you see some sort of goofy stuff happening. You know, the ping pong table, the beanbag chairs, you know, what we call that Googleization of space, the rock climbing walls and all that sort of stuff, you know, and that's fine. I don't have a problem with any of that stuff. It's great to do if you've got the money, right? But what we find is the workspace can actually help engagement in a different way. And this is really a big, important issue for organizations. I mean, here's some data. You probably have read this data. It's all very recent. For example, you know, Gallup, who just, by the way, if you haven't read it, has just released 2 weeks ago their State of the American Workplace. And what they find is that most CEOs say that they feel like about 70% of their workforce is disengaged, right? Disengaged, that's like making a C in college. I mean, you show up, you do the minimum that's required, you know, you're getting your work done, but you're not excelling, right? That's the perspective that CEOs have, according to Gallup. And Gallup finds that when they talk to employees themselves, that only about 25 or 26% of them report being highly engaged, right? You're enthusiastic, you wear the company hat, you come in on Saturday, you volunteer, you see somebody else screwing up, you step in and help. The reason we want more people who are highly engaged, obviously, is because there's other studies that demonstrate that the more people you have that are highly engaged, the better your companies do. And we also know that HR is always struggling to find and keep talent. Gallup actually reports that as many as 50% of everyone in your organization is probably looking for another job. Maybe not actively, but they're sort of keeping their eye open, even if they're not sending their resume out. So the question becomes, what can space do about this? Well, it turns out that in this last Gallup study, one of the interesting facts that came out was that when we talk to these employees who report being highly engaged, 60% of the time they are away from the office. So, you know, this sort of begs the question, are they engaged because they're not at work, or because they get to work from other places, or because they're staying away from a bad situation? In other words, they can't get their work done at home, and they're highly engaged because they're not around that. So I think this raises some issues for us that we could dig into to figure out what's going on, because clearly we want, even though people want to work away from home, we do want them to have that freedom, but when they can, we want them obviously to come to work as much as possible, and we also want them to feel engaged. Now, at Herman Miller, we've been studying these workplaces that I described to you earlier, these free address activity-based workplaces, and when we talk to people about why they like them and why they're successful, because I have to tell you, they have been highly successful, the ones that I've done. When we ask people afterwards, why were you willing to give up your office, or we know you were concerned about, you know, where you're going to sit every day and where do you keep your stuff, and you're not going to be able to personalize the desk, and all these other things that people said they were worried about. You know, how will I find so-and-so? How will I know if so-and-so is not working, if I can't see her, that sort of thing. What we found is all of that stuff sort of went away when people moved into these workspaces because it gave them choice. And you know, what's really going on here is that we're consumers at heart. I mean, our whole culture, our economy is built on choice and consumer. And the example I like to point out is deodorant, right? You go to the store to buy deodorant, and how many different deodorants are there on the shelf? I mean, there's hundreds, right? Well, maybe not hundreds, but there's at least 100 different kinds of deodorant. Now, you know they all do the same thing, of course. We know that intellectually. But what Lever Brothers and Procter & Gamble or Unilever, what all those people have figured out now, that they're going to provide enough variety so that you, as an individual person, can make the choice that you think is right for you, because it's empowering. And that's what the consumer society is. That's who we are. And so what we're finding is when we create these workplaces that have a lot of variety, just by giving people choice, even if they choose to sit at the same place every day, just the fact they know they have the choices enough to offset any sort of trivial concerns they had about the shift in the workplace. Transparency, turns out, is very important, not only in the process you go through, but the ability to see others, particularly the ability, again, to see your boss. And then the last one turns out to be fairness. When people know they're all being treated fairly and they're being treated the same, and some people aren't being called out. You know, I hear some organizations say, well, we're going to move to this, but we're going to let these 10 people do something different because they're really special, and we're not going to make them do this other thing. Well, as soon as you say that, then what you're saying is the other 90 people are being made to do something, and it smacks of unfairness. So it turns out that these are the three factors that are really sort of propelling the workplace to change and people to accept it. Now, we do collect this data lots of different ways. I just want to share one chart with you from an organization in England called Leesman. You may know Leesman. They're the biggest researcher of workplace change, especially how physical changes in the workplace affect engagement. This is just a typical report out of theirs, and they have hundreds of different variables that they measure. But when they do that, one of the things they do is they tend to organize the workplace into 4 types. They ask people, do you work in a flexible workplace and you personally have a lot of choice? Are you in a flexible workplace but you really don't have a lot of choice? So in other words, yeah, it may be great, there's a lot of settings, but I'm pretty much stuck at my desk. Do you sit in a private office, or do you sit in a cubicle in an open plan area? This flexible with high choice at the top is the one I was describing earlier, which is the sort of free address activity-based workplace. And what you see by this first question is, regardless of what type of space you're in, most people report that the workplace design is important. But as you move down and look at these other variables, you find that there's a very divergent responses. For example, my workplace enables me to work to have productivity or work productively. What you find is the people with the highest choice, in fact, for all questions, the people with the highest choice tend to be the ones who report the most positive results. The people with the lowest choice, as you might expect, who are in an otherwise flexible environment, these are the people who are the most, have the most low responses. So for these people, there is a lot of choice built into the environment, but they personally are not able to avail themselves. That's where the fairness issue comes in. So you know, we don't have to go into these in detail. If you're interested, you can go to Leesman. It's called leesmanindex.org, I believe, and they have a lot of really great variables that you can read their information. We use them. We also have our own 2 or 3 instruments that we use. Now, we've only got 4 or 5 minutes left here, so I'd like to just share 2 examples with you. And the first one I'm going to share with you, I want to show you because it's an example that is not necessarily open. I think when people hear about new workplaces, they automatically assume open workplace. And I hear people all the time, especially facility managers and space planners and organizations say, well, we told people we're going to move to an open collaborative environment and they really don't want to do it. They really hate it. And as I mentioned earlier, I said, well, the first thing you should do is stop saying that. Don't keep saying open, because the workplace, a new workplace, is not necessarily about being open. It's about having enough seats and the right type of seats to support the way people work. This is a really good example of that. This plan that I'm showing you right now, the left-hand side of the plan is what the whole floor used to look like, okay? Everyone got a private office and there were secretaries in the hallway. The whole floor looked like this. Now, this is the paradigm at this company. These are pretty high-level research people. They've got JDs, there's MDs in here, there's PhDs. They're very high-level people. They're pretty, but it turns out they're not here a lot. It turns out they're only in these offices about 20% of the time, so they were in hopes of trying to accommodate more people on the floor. And so what this organization was going to do was to rip down all of these private offices and put everybody at benching or cubicles. But when I asked them what these people are actually doing, and I observed them, what I found is that when these people are in these offices, when they do come in, which is only about a day a week, it turns out they were doing exactly what we're doing right now. They were interviewing people, they were Skyping, they were doing video conferencing. Often there were two people in the room and they were video conferencing and or Skyping a third. And so my response was, well, you know what, these rooms are actually pretty good for that. But if they're only here one day a week, maybe they just don't need to own them. Right? So if you look at the right-hand side of the plan, which is the pilot, and it's built, they moved in a year ago, they've been in there a year now, and what you'll see is we left these offices around the perimeter. We took the ones on the very end off because there's a good view there, there's natural light, and those offices have become sort of high status. Now we did change the offices. We took all the drywall off, we changed it to glass, we did more acoustical work between the rooms because these walls you could hear straight through. The secretaries or the admins who were out in the hallway, now they do have assigned seating, and there's some open seating for people when they just want to come in and work by themselves and they're not going to be doing the video and Skyping. These rooms are outfitted slightly differently. A lot of them are set up for the video conferencing, but some have lounge chairs, some have club chairs. And then we also put in a much bigger plaza. Remember that plan I showed you with the big central plaza? It's got booths. This is all Wi-Fi. It's not showing in this rendering, but any desk you sit at, as soon as you sit down, you can plug your laptop in and you have double monitors. This has been highly successful. In the past, they had one office for every one person. Now they have one office for about every 3 people. And this has been highly successful, but the reason I like to show it is if you look at this environment, it's not necessarily about just being open. It's about having the right kind of space in the right quantity and the right ratio sharing. And then I'll share one more with you. This is a firm that was a little bit different than the last one. This firm was actually looking to reduce real estate. They wanted to see if they could get everyone on this floor, and you see that's mostly, I think there's 162 workstations here, and some private offices and conference rooms. They wanted to see if they could get everybody onto just one wing of this building. Now, their original thought, of course, was that you put everybody at much smaller desks and then you could get all of these people into the same area. Now, obviously, the concern with that is that it's really crowded. People are going to be on top of each other. They're going to start complaining about noise and privacy issues. So we did a space study, and yes, we did find that these people are only here about 37% of the time. So we did 2 plans. The first plan we did was one that's very conventional. It's like that middle approach I showed you. People who are there often, more than 50% of the time, get an assigned workstation at these green workstations. Then the people who are there less than 50% of the time, when they come in, they can use one of these brown workstations, which actually is the same size work surfaces as the other workstations. They just don't have storage underneath them, and there's some shared storage down the middle. These are all 7-foot work surfaces. I try never to go below 7 feet for an individual workstation because people need room to spread apart from each other and spread their stuff out. So that's what's going on here. And yes, I could get everyone in. In fact, if you look at the hatched area over here, you could see that they don't need that area anymore because they've moved about half of their people to these unassigned stations based on the fact that they're only there 35% of the time. But the problem with this environment, in my opinion, is telling someone that they can come in and choose any seat they want as long as one of those seats is like Henry Ford saying you can have your Model T in any color as long as it's black, right? I think the better thing to do, and this is where I'll end, is just to say, look, instead of accommodating people in those just rows and rows and rows of workstations, some assigned, some not, put in a true free address, activity-based workplace, which is very rich, lots of different kind of settings, a big plaza with booths and banquettes and tables, big coffee bar, lots of different kind of closed and open spaces. I still can accommodate the same number of people, but it's a much nicer and richer environment. So this is, in general, this is the big trend that we're seeing, and it's the data that really supports moving in this direction. So now my clock is chiming, which tells me it's 1 o'clock, and I haven't really left enough time for everyone to stay on and have messages or questions, but I'll stay on, of course, as long as you'd like.
Thank you so much, Margaret. I think one of the things that we heard from a bunch of people is that they're interested in the paper that you mentioned about pushbacks and responses.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to get that over
Okay.
to me, I can make sure it goes out to everyone who attended today.
Okay, I'll do that.
That would be great. And then I can stay on as well. If anyone has questions, just type it in the chat box. Margaret and I can stay on for a few more minutes.
Okay.
Great.
Otherwise, thank you. Thank you for attending.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Thanks, Angel. So we have Julie who asked, how do you sell these ideas? So Margaret, I think that's something that you mentioned you'd covered in that paper that we can send out, but let me know.
Well, you know, selling the idea and pushback are two different things. Pushback is just sort of how do you answer the quick little, well, what do I do with my stuff and how can I find Bill? Selling it is a bigger issue, and I think that if you start off by understanding what is really driving the organization to change, whether it's better use of space or more innovation or more engagement, it's usually a combination of those, and you figure out what people's metrics are. Well, how much space do you want to save? How much innovation do you want? What else are you doing in the organization to do that? And here's how space can do it. And you collect the data on how space is being used and the type of activities people are doing when they're there. Then you don't have to sort of sell it per se. You just have to show it. You just have to say, look, here's the data, here's the way we're working, and here are our goals around utilization, innovation, and engagement, and this is the best response to it. So I think, you know, the idea if you have to sell something that people find onerous, then you probably will never be able to sell it.
And we received another question from Ashley Dunn. She says, for the 3 items with measurable outcomes, visibility, proximity, the 30-meter rule, and what was the third one?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's 3. There's layout, which you can measure with the space syntax, which is the number of paths and all that sort of stuff. Then there is visibility, which is just called isovist, and that's just knowing that the more people you can see, the better people sort of feel about themselves, even if they don't talk to the other people. And then the third one was this notion of distance. And, you know, distance is just what it is. It's just a phenomenon. The only thing you can try and do is just overcome it, be aware of it, and create plans that help sort of address it. It's a known phenomenon. You can't change people.
Great, thank you.
So it was layout, distance, and visibility.
Great. Okay, and I think that's all we've gotten for questions. So again, thanks to everyone.
Right. I will send you that other document.
Great, we really appreciate you taking the time. This was wonderful.
It was my pleasure. Talk to you later.
Talk to you later. Thanks, everyone.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.